the sight of blue police lights reflecting off the pristine, centuries-old marble of our family estate in Gmunden is an image that will be seared into my mind until the day I die. It was supposed to be the crowning moment of my life, a celebration of love and a final escape from the shadows of my past. Instead, it became a public execution of our family's reputation. But to understand the wreckage of my wedding day, one must understand the cold, calculated rot that began years ago in our penthouse overlooking Vienna's Ringstrasse. My name is Maximilian von Stetten, and for 31 years, I lived in the shadow of a saint who was actually a viper. My sister, Isabella, 2 years my senior, was the golden child of the Viennese elite. She possessed a magnetic, almost predatory charm that drew people into her orbit, while I was the quiet architect, preferring the precision of blueprints to the messy theatrics of high society. Growing up, our rivalry wasn't born of playground squabbles. It was a psychological siege. If I excelled in my studies at the gymnasium, she would orchestrate a social scandal to eclipse my achievements. Our parents, Baron Friedrich and Baroness Helga, were obsessed with the Stetten legacy, a concept that demanded perfection and, more importantly, the appearance of it. They lumped us together like two sides of the same coin. Yet Isabella spent every waking hour trying to tarnish mine. As we reached adulthood, her competitive streak curdled into something far more sinister. She didn't just want to win. She wanted to see me lose everything. The tension reached a breaking point 5 years ago when I was on the verge of securing a senior partnership at Steiner and Associates, the most prestigious architectural firm in Austria. It was a role I had bled for, countless nights over drafting tables, certifications from London, and successful projects in Salzburg. It was my ticket to independence, away from the stifling influence of the Stetten name. Then, the call came. The HR director's voice was as cold as a Viennese winter. The offer was rescinded. They had received an anonymous dossier, emails, photos, and fabricated medical records, claiming I was a high-functioning heroin addict who had embezzled funds from my previous firm to fund my habit. They even included a fake criminal record from a supposed arrest in Prague. My world collapsed. I knew instantly it was her. Only Isabella had the access to my personal files and the twisted creativity to weave such a convincing lie. When I confronted her in her lavish apartment, she didn't deny it. She sipped her wine and told me, with terrifying calm, that I was becoming too arrogant with my little successes. She claimed she was doing me a favor, teaching me humility. That day, I walked out and severed every tie, leaving the Stetten name behind to rebuild my life from the ashes in a small studio in Graz. I spent years in self-imposed exile, rebuilding my reputation block by painstaking block. It was during this time that I met Sophie, a woman whose soul was as clear as the Alpine lakes. We fell in love, and for a while, I forgot the poison of my family. But the Baron and Baroness would not let me go so easily. They were horrified by the estrangement, not because they missed me, but because it looked bad at the opera ball. They spent years badgering me to forgive. Isabella, using the family is everything mantra as a weapon. They ignored the fact that Isabella had professionally assassinated me. To them, it was just a sibling misunderstanding that needed to be swept under the Persian rugs. When Sophie and I got engaged, the pressure intensified. They demanded she be at the wedding, claiming that a Stetten ceremony without the whole lineage would be a scandal. I remained firm. I told them Isabella was dead to me. But as the wedding date at our lakeside estate approached, a strange feeling began to gnaw at me. I had hired an old friend, an investigator named Klaus, to look into some inconsistencies. I'd noticed in the family's charitable trust something Isabella had been managing. I didn't do it out of malice, but out of a lingering sense of self-preservation. What Klaus found was a rabbit hole of deceit that made her sabotage of my job look like child's play. Isabella wasn't just a mean sister. She was a predator. She had been using the Stetten name to front a sophisticated art forgery ring, selling rediscovered sketches of Austrian masters to international collectors. The addiction lies she spread about me years ago weren't just to humble me. They were to ensure that if I ever looked into the family books, no one would believe a junkie. The day of the wedding in Gmunden was breathtaking. The Tronsea Lake was a mirror of deep blue, and the air smelled of pine and expensive champagne. Everything was perfect until the reception began. I was taking photos with Sophie when I saw them, my parents, walking toward the terrace with Isabella clinging to my father's arm like a trophy. They had lied to me, promised she wouldn't come, and then smuggled her in, betting that I wouldn't. Cause a scene in front of the creme de la creme of Austrian society. Isabella wore a smug, victorious smile, her eyes scanning the room as if she owned the guests. My blood turned to ice. My parents whispered that I should just be a man and accept her presence for the sake of the family's image. They had no idea that the image they were so desperate to protect was already a hollow shell, filled with Isabella's crimes. I didn't scream. I didn't make a scene. I simply walked to the edge of the terrace and took out my phone. I had told Klaus to wait for my signal. I knew that Isabella was planning to use the wedding as a high-profile networking event to find her next mark, a wealthy Swiss investor who was among our guests. As the police cars roared up the long, gravel driveway, the music stopped. The confusion among the guests was palpable. 2 inspectors from the Federal Criminal Office stepped onto the terrace. My sister's face shifted from smugness to a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She tried to retreat into the house, but they were faster. They didn't just ask her to leave. They read her rights for grand larceny, identity theft, and fraud. It turned out the Swiss investor was an undercover agent Klaus had alerted weeks ago. The drama didn't end with the clicking of handcuffs on Isabella's wrists. My parents, in a fit of delusional loyalty, tried to physically block the officers. My father shouted about his titles, while my mother tried to snatch the evidence bag containing Isabella's burner phone. It was a pathetic display of a dying aristocracy clinging to a lie. The officers, unfazed by the Stetten name, promptly arrested both of them for obstruction of justice and complicity. As they were being led away, the silence on the terrace was deafening. I stood there, the groom in a bespoke tuxedo, watching my entire family being loaded into transport vans. My sister looked at me one last time, her eyes promising a vengeance that she would now have years to cultivate in a cell. My parents looked not at me, but at the ground, finally realizing that their obsession with legacy had led to its total destruction. I turned to my guests and apologized, my voice trembling not with sadness, but with the weight of a decade of suppressed trauma. I told them the wedding was over. Sophie and I left the estate that night and never went back. We were married a week later in a tiny chapel in the mountains, with only 2 witnesses and the sound of the wind for a choir. The fallout was immense. The Stetten name was dragged through every tabloid from Vienna to Berlin. Isabella is currently serving an 8-year sentence, and my parents are living in a disgraced, self-imposed exile in a small villa, their wealth drained by legal fees. I lost my family that day, but I gained my life. I realized that blood doesn't make a family. Integrity does. Now, when I look at the blueprints for my new life, I see no shadows, only the clear, bright lines of a future built on truth. The weeks following the arrests were not the peaceful sanctuary I had envisioned. Instead of the quiet alpine air of our mountain honeymoon, Sophie and I found ourselves drowning in a sea of legal documents and depositions. Klaus, my investigator, visited me at our secluded rental in Hallstatt, his face grimmer than usual. He had spent nights digging through the digital remains of my father's charity, the Stetten Foundation for the Arts. What he found wasn't just Isabella's individual greed. It was a systemic machine of corruption that had been humming for decades. My sister hadn't just accidentally discovered an art forgery ring. She had inherited it. The most devastating revelation came from a series of encrypted ledgers. My mother, the Ice Baroness Helga, wasn't just a bystander or a deluded parent. She was the treasurer. She had been using Isabella as a shield, knowing that her daughter's flamboyant personality would attract any potential scrutiny, leaving her to move the millions through shell companies in Liechtenstein and the Cayman Islands. The betrayal I felt in that moment was a different kind of pain, a cold, numbing realization that my entire existence had been a calculated expense for them. They didn't just prefer Isabella because she was golden. They preferred her because she was useful. I, with my obsession for ethics and my penchant for architectural transparency, was a liability. The addiction scandal she had manufactured years ago wasn't just a sibling's spiteful whim. Klaus showed me a draft of a revised family trust document, dated just weeks before my career was ruined. If I had been convicted of a crime or officially diagnosed as an addict, my portion of the Stetten inheritance, a vast sum tied to the family's real estate holdings in Graz, would have been forfeited and redirected into the foundation. My own mother had signed the directive to neutralize the risk I posed to their empire. As the trial began in the imposing halls of the Landesgericht for criminal matters in Vienna, I stood as the primary witness for the prosecution. Looking at them behind the glass, they didn't look like my family. My father looked like a defeated ghost, but my mother, her eyes remained fixed on me with a terrifying, unyielding coldness. She didn't look like a woman caught in a crime. She looked like a general who had lost a battle but was already planning the next campaign. The drama escalated when Isabella's defense lawyer, a man known for his ruthless tactics, attempted to turn the tables. He presented a witness, a former colleague of mine from Steiner and Associates, who claimed that I was the one who had introduced Isabella to the art forgers. It was a desperate, final attempt at character assassination, a shadow play meant to sow enough doubt to keep the Baroness out of a cell. But they had underestimated Klaus and the trail of digital breadcrumbs they had left behind. The turning point came not in the courtroom, but in the dimly lit halls of the Leopold Museum. An anonymous tip had reached Klaus, a message that promised the missing link between the forgeries and their high-ranking government officials who had looked the other way for years. I went there alone, against Sophie's pleas, feeling like a character in a noir film. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and floor wax. I met a man who went by the name the Conservator, an elderly gentleman who had worked for our family for 40 years. He handed me a leather-bound journal that belonged to my grandfather. As I flipped through the pages, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The Stetten family wealth wasn't built on textiles or trade, as the history books claimed. It was built on the systematic looting of private collections during the chaos of the post-war years. My parents weren't just forgers. They were guardians of a dark legacy they were desperate to legitimize through Isabella's discoveries. This discovery was the leverage I needed. I didn't take it to the police immediately. I went to the prison to visit Isabella. It was the first time we had spoken since the wedding. She looked haggard, the glamour of the ringstrass stripped away by the harsh, fluorescent lights of the visiting room. I showed her the journal through the glass. Her reaction wasn't fear. It was a hollow laugh. She told me that I was a fool if I thought the truth would set me free. She revealed that Baron Kohlheinz, our favorite uncle and a powerful figure in the Ministry of Justice, was the one who had been protecting them. He was the architect of my downfall, the one who had ensured no firm in Austria would hire me. He wanted the Stetten legacy to remain untainted by my modern morals. The betrayal had layers I hadn't even begun to peel back. I realized then that this wasn't just a case of fraud. It was a war for the soul of my lineage. Kohlheinz had been the one whispering in my mother's ear. feeding her paranoia that I would expose them all. He was the one who had orchestrated the addiction evidence, using his connections in the medical board. As I left the prison, I knew that the trial was just the beginning. The real enemy wasn't sitting behind bars yet. He was sitting in a high-back chair in a government office, watching my every move. But I wasn't the scared architect anymore. I had the journal, I had Klaus, and I had the truth. The plot had twisted so far that the family drama had become a national scandal. And I was the only one left to burn the whole structure down to save what was left of my name. The atmosphere in Vienna grew suffocating. Every headline was a dagger. Every sideways glance from former colleagues a reminder of the Stetten stain. But the real threat wasn't the press. It was the silence from the Ministry of Justice. Uncle Karl-Heinz hadn't made a public statement. And that was the most terrifying omen of all. A week after my visit to Isabella, an invitation arrived at my doorstep in Graz, not by mail, but delivered by a man in a dark suit who didn't wait for a signature. It was a summons to the family's private hunting lodge, a Jagdschloss deep in the Styrian forests near Mariazell. The note, written in Karl-Heinz's precise, old-fashioned script, was simple. The legacy is more than a journal. Bring it to me, and Sophie stays safe. My heart stopped. I had kept Sophie hidden in a safe house provided by Klaus. But Karl-Heinz's reach was longer than I had dared to imagine. He wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was the spider at the center of a web that included the very police I thought were protecting us. I spent the night looking at the blueprints of the lodge. My father had bought it in the 80s, but as an architect, I knew its secrets better than anyone. I remembered the renovations, the reinforced basement, the hidden surveillance systems disguised as hunting trophies. This wasn't a meeting. It was an execution. Klaus begged me not to go, or at least to let him bring a team. But we both knew that if any official police presence was detected, Karl-Heinz would vanish into the shadows, and Sophie would pay the price. I had to play his game, but I would use his own arrogance against him. I spent those final hours digitizing the grandfather's journal and embedding the files into a cloud server with a dead man's switch. If I didn't check in every 6 hours, the entire history of the Stetten looting and the names of the officials involved, including Karl-Heinz, would be sent to every major news outlet in Europe and the International Criminal Court. The drive to Mariazell was a journey through a frozen purgatory. The Styrian Alps were draped in a heavy, oppressive fog that seemed to swallow the road. As I approached the lodge, the silhouette of the dark timber structure looked like a predatory beast, crouching in the snow. Karl-Heinz was waiting for me in the great hall, seated by a roaring fire that provided no warmth to the room's icy tension. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like the embodiment of the Austrian establishment, refined, cultured, and utterly heartless. He poured 2 glasses of expensive schnapps and spoke of family, duty as if he hadn't spent the last decade trying to destroy me. He demanded the journal, claiming that the era of the Stetten family was too grand to be ended by a disgruntled son. But as he spoke, I realized he didn't know I was already broadcasting our conversation. My tie-pin wasn't an heirloom. It was a high-frequency transmitter Klaus had modified. The air in the lodge was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of fear. Karl-Heinz's voice was a low, melodic drone as he explained why I had to disappear for the sake of the state's stability. He admitted to everything: the forgery ring, the framing of my career, even the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened the Stetten Ministry alliance. He believed he was untouchable because he controlled the local gendarmerie. He showed me a document, a confession I was supposed to sign, stating that I had acted alone in the forgery ring and that my parents and sister were my unwitting pawns. In exchange, Sophie would be released. It was a masterpiece of legal entrapment. But I didn't sign. Instead, I stood up and walked to the massive stone fireplace, holding the original journal over the flames. I told him that the legacy he loved so much was already ash, because the truth wasn't in the paper. It was in the digital cloud he couldn't reach. His composure finally shattered. The mask of the refined statesman slipped, revealing a desperate, cornered animal. He signaled to the shadows, and two men stepped forward, not police, but private security with the cold eyes of mercenaries. Just as the lead moved toward me, the heavy oak doors of the lodge were breached. It wasn't the local police Karlheinz controlled, but the EKO Cobra, Austria's elite tactical unit. Klaus hadn't gone to the ministry. He had gone to the European Anti-Fraud Office, Olaf, and the Federal Intelligence Service, presenting them with the live feed of Karlheinz's confession. The untouchable uncle was tackled to the floor of his own hunting lodge, his face pressed into the very rug where he had planned my demise. The betrayal was complete, but this time, it was the family's turn to feel the weight of the law. The aftermath was a whirlwind of fire and light. Sophie was found unharmed in a mountain hut only miles away. She had been used as a psychological lever, a cruel game Karlheinz played to ensure my compliance. The fall of the Stetten dynasty was the largest political scandal in modern Austrian history. The Styrian trap became a textbook case of how power can be dismantled by the very people it tries to crush. My parents and Isabella were eventually joined in prison by Karlheinz, who received the maximum sentence for treason and corruption. As for me, I stood on the balcony of our new, modest home in the Salzkammergut, looking out at the mountains. The Stetten name is gone, replaced by a simple, honest identity. I am no longer an architect of buildings for a corrupt elite. I am the architect of my own freedom. The drama is over, the detective work is done, and for the first time in 31 years, the silence of the Alps feels like peace.